So hello and welcome to History at Night. History at Night is an ongoing speaker series hosted by the Friends of San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site. I'm just going to give it a moment as people file in and are able to log on to this webinar. So we'll just give it another minute and then we'll get started. And I can see that people are coming in, almost ready to get started. And I think we're good to go. Okay, so welcome to History at Night. My name is Eleanor Stoddard. I'm the educator here at San Felipe de Austin State Historic Site. I'll be your host this evening. So tonight, the theme is Stoic Women and Manly Rebels, Gender and the Runaway Scrape with Dr. Linda English. This webinar will be recorded and posted online on our Facebook page, the YouTube channel of the Texas Historical Commission, and our website. If you have questions during this evening's discussion, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A section. And please feel free to ask your questions as the lecture goes on, and we'll take a look at them at the end. We have staff members who may be able to answer some of your queries there, but we'll also share as many questions as we can with Dr. English after our discussion is through. We'll also share our contact information at the conclusion of the webinar. And as well, if you'd like to let us know where you're tuning in from, please let us know in the chat section. Now, before we get into Dr. English's presentation, I'd like to spend a little bit of time introducing her. I first learned about her work when I attended one of the Humanities Texas online professional development webinar series, all about teaching Texas history. If you're a teacher of Texas history, these free teacher institutes, as they are known, are well worth your time. So check out the Humanities Texas website for some more information. So Dr. Linda English is an associate professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. She received her PhD in American history from the University of Oklahoma in May of 2005. She taught as a lecturer at OU and the University of Northern Colorado before her current position at UTRGV, which was previously known as UTPA. Her research and publications focus primarily on race, class, and gender during the late 19th century, specifically Texas and Indian Territory. Her current research examines the Runaway Scrape and other aspects of the Texas Revolution through the lens of gender. Her latest articles include That Very Trying Time, Guy Morrison Bryan Recalls the Runaway Scrape, which was published in 2018, and another article entitled, Madam, You Ought to Be the Man at Such Times as These, Gendered Confrontations and the Runaway Scrape, which was published in American 19th Century History in 2018. Her latest book is titled, By All Accounts, General Stores and Community Life in Texas and Indian Territory, which was published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2013, and the paperback version just came out this year. As well, she's also working on a book about the last months of the Texas Revolution. And with that, let's turn things over to Dr. English and begin our look at the Runaway Scrape.
Well, thank you, Eleanor, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for attending this session. So I am going to ultimately share my screen with you and present a slideshow, but I will be back to answer questions. So even though I won't be actually on the screen for much of this presentation, I will eventually be back. So let me start the process by sharing my screen here. Let's see. Is that showing up, Eleanor? You can
Yes,
see it?
yeah, it all looks good here.
Okay, so this is the title of my talk, Stoic Women and Manly Rebels, Gender and the Runaway Scrape. And the presentation that I'm gonna give tonight is from this larger manuscript I wrote on the last couple months of the Texas Revolution. And I'm gonna explain over the course of the presentation why I'm focused on the last couple months of the Texas Revolution. I mean, it's a short revolution to begin with. So this is a very condensed study, but I, wanted to look at something that had not really been examined in a book length before, and so that's what my manuscript focuses on. So I want to go into defining my terms. So part of my title for this talk includes the word gender and the term runaway scrape. So let's sort of start with understanding what I mean by gender. So when I'm talking about gender, I'm not talking about biological sex. I'm not talking about biological men and women. I'm talking about a concept that's much more fluid. I'm talking about socially constructed notions about what it meant to be a man and a woman in the 19th century. And so these ideas of masculine and feminine roles and behavior and expectations that are tied to what it meant to be a man and a woman in the 19th century. And you can well imagine that, you know, the responsibilities and behaviors of a man in 1830s Texas or a woman in 1830s Texas is quite different than what you would have, you know, in the 1920s or the 1950s or today. So this is a fluid term that changes over time and changes in terms of society. So it's socially constructed. Now, the other part of this is the runaway scrape. And I've come to realize that not everybody knows what the runaway scrape is. And so the runaway scrape denotes this period that really is at its peak in March and April of 1836. And a couple of key events have happened by this point. The fall of the Alamo battle that began on February 23rd and ended on March 6th, obviously is a significant loss for the Texas forces. And the massacre at Goliad is also a significant event that happens. And you'll notice that both of these events take place in March. So again, that is the sort of peak period. Also Sam Houston's retreat. Now I'm gonna actually spend some more time talking about what that meant, Sam Houston's retreat, as we get to a later stage of the presentation. But this is another significant event. And with the culmination of these three events, the fall of the Alamo, the massacre at Goliad, Sam Houston's retreat, what do all of these have in common? Well, they're not good moments for the Texas forces during the Texas Revolution. And this is a perilous moment. This is when things look especially dire. And it looks like that, you know, the revolution is going to fail. And so when people hear word of these events and they find out that the Texas Army is retreating towards the United States, towards the Louisiana border, this creates a moment of crisis, okay? Families that are living in South Central Texas start packing up everything they can, if they can, even if they have time, and they run for their lives. This is a moment where people are in a panic. And so the runaway scrape, what you're talking about here is people are running away from the Mexican forces during this period. So you have Santa Anna's forces on the march, advancing into Central Texas and into the locations where there are in fact, farms and plantations, families feeling unprotected and vulnerable. And they run for their lives. Now, we're going to get into what we mean by families, but a lot of these families are going to be made up of women and children who are not involved in the fight, as well as their slaves, if they had them. So these are who are taking to the road during this time period. So the runaway scrape is this panicked last couple of months. And one of the reasons why I'm focused on this time period is because it brings everybody into the discussion of the Texas Revolution. Okay, so this is a famous painting in the Texas Senate, The Dawn of the Alamo. And I think what you'll notice about this painting, this very famous painting, is it's made up of men. Okay, so when people think of the Texas Revolution, they think about the Alamo. The Alamo gets, thousands of visitors every year. It is sort of what people know of when they think of Texas history, right? They think about the fall of the Alamo. This is what television shows are made of and movies are made of. And so and what to keep in mind there is that it's a male episode. It's a male-centric event. Okay, so part of the reason why I wanted to sort of tell the story is to fill in that story. And so I want to talk about women, but I'm not exclusively going to talk about women, because remember, I want to go back to this notion of gender, what it meant to be a woman, what it meant to be a man during this time period. So I'm going to talk about sort of a crisis of masculinity during this time period. I'm going to be talking about, it's affecting everybody. And so we will also be talking about women's heroicism during this moment in the retreat. Now, this is a picture of Davy Crockett, because, man-centric event, where, our heroes of the fallen Alamo. So this is a larger question that I'm hoping to get at in the course of this discussion is, did the latter stages, these last couple months of the revolution, specifically the runaway scrape, did it create circumstances that challenged 19th century notions of gender? Okay, and so in order to sort of get at that question, I want to kind of step back and talk about what were the 19th century notions of gender? What were the expectations of men and women during this time period? Okay. So to do so, I'm going to be reading, especially voices from the time period, so you can get a real feel for what was written by people of the time period and people written about the experience written later in life. So this is actually from a newspaper article talking about women's role during the Runaway Scrape, describing the stoic feats of women. This was a harrowing and weakening to these brave women, but hope never failed them. Glorious women. Their husbands achieved glory and gave a new nation to the world at San Jacinto. But these women on that marvelous retreat gave as bright a luster to the annals of Texas as the men did. Okay, so that's classically the way that the Runaway Scrape and women are sort of presented. It's harrowing, they're weak, they're frightened, it's terrifying, and they're running for their lives. But in the effort of running for their lives, they are heroic. So what I wanted to do is fill in that story and look at what that actually meant for women during this time period. So I've got up here and on this slide, the cult of domesticity or true womanhood. And this is a notion that is associated with women's identity and, who they were in the 19th century. So 19th century prescriptive literature promoted the notion of the cult of domesticity or true womanhood. Prescriptive literature, what that is ladies' magazines and journals from this time period that are published, and their audiences tend to be, educated women of a certain class that can afford women's magazines. But what makes it prescriptive is when they talk about sort of what women should be doing. Okay, it's an ideal that's presented in prescriptive literature. So these notions limited a woman's sphere to the home and subjugated her power to the male head of household. Okay, true women were supposed to possess 4 cardinal virtues, and I've got them on here: piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. So women were said to be, according to this ideal, more pious, more religious, more pure. Okay, they were submissive, naturally submissive. Okay, and their role was in the home. Okay, so their natural role. And keep in mind, this is like people are writing this saying this is the natural home for women. Okay, so I've got a quote here. It gives you a feel for what we're talking about with regards to prescriptive literature. This is the sort of thing you would see in the magazines. Domestic life is a woman's sphere. And it is there that she is most usefully as well as most appropriately employed. Her presence may be a pledge against impropriety and excess, a check on vice, and a protection to virtue. Okay, so that's the example that you're getting there. And then I've got more that I will expand on here. But I want to say this about this. Tropes of separate spheres, okay, and domestic ideology, however, represent an ideal, not the reality of a lot of women in the 19th century. Okay, and what I tell my students when I'm talking about this is that imagine if you were trying to understand our present day, and you said, in order to understand our present day, what women are about in the present day, you need to go and get Vogue magazine or Cosmopolitan, and that will tell you all about women during our present time. This is what they look like. This is what they are interested in. So you can see the problem of using magazines as your sort of source. You have to sort of understand what it is they're trying to do there. Okay, so it's an ideal. Women's experiences are much more complex, more nuanced. Rustic frontier conditions blurred gender labor divisions. Okay, if you're in a rural setting, and further defined spheres that confined women's labor to the household and decision-making responsibilities to the males, well, all of that gets complicated in a time of war. So if men are not there, how does this all sort of square, right? So both of these conditions that were at play in Texas in 1836. So we already see an upending of this ideal. Now, it's in the 19th century, in the 20th century, certainly a woman's responsibility was tied to the household. Okay, that was true then, and it's not the only time that has been true. And so I've got a quote here from Lydia Howard Sigourney, who was also somebody that was well published in prescriptive literature. Since the domestic sphere is entrusted to our sex, and the proper arrangement and government of a household are so closely connected with our enjoyments and virtues, nothing that involves the house or the rational comfort of home is unworthy of attention. So this is basically saying, spend your time, women, working on the household. And, you think back to this period in Texas history, the late 1820s, early 1830s, a lot of people are just arriving to Texas. They're creating their households during this time period and taking pride in their households, perhaps in this time period. So, you have a lot of newly settled people that are part of this experience. And, we got to believe that this is going to have a huge impact on women and their households, right? I want to give you another quote from a woman who was in early Texas during this time period, a woman named Mary Sherwood Whiteman Helm. She reiterated that the family, and by extension the home, remained in the purview of women as sacred precincts. She wrote, "Here, woman by her unostentatiousness, sorry, I'm struggling over that word, and hallowed influence reigns preeminently. She may not preside in church or state, but she trains the hand that ministers in the one and guides in the other." So women's role is sort of in shaping, men during this time period. So, again, sort of stressing this domestic role. So during the Runaway Scrape, I see it really as a traumatic event in women's lives. Okay, a destabilizing period by all accounts. The Runaway Scrape upended any sense of domestic tranquility. Okay, although the entire episode was short-lived, lasting only a couple of months, the tumult left lasting scars. Homes deserted, families torn asunder, and vulnerable travelers who succumbed to the elements in the course of taking to the road. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a few different figures, but this is one of the sources that I use a lot. It's the journal of Anne Rainey Coleman, who experienced the Runaway Scrape. And so I'm going to be giving you some of her insights. She wrote about her experiences later in life. She started her memoirs in the 1870s. At the time of the Runaway Scrape, she was a woman in her early 20s. And so she, it doesn't get made available to people into the 20th century. She gives it to her niece, and her niece will eventually donate it to academics who, shape it into the form of this book, which you can, if you're interested in the topic, read Victorian Lady on the Texas Frontier. And so this is her sort of experience of leaving her home. Okay, so Anne Rainey Coleman remembered feeling sadness when she was forced to leave her newly settled Texas home. "I shut the doors, though my husband told me it would be of little use. Before night, he said, everything in the house will be sacked. My husband helped me on my horse. A tear came unbidden in my eyes. In his attempt to console her, Anne's husband told her not to look back. However, it was too hard for her to obey such advice, and she found herself having to look back several times after I left the house with a heavy heart." So you can sort of see the impact of leaving this home. And I've got another example by Creed Taylor, who was a scout in the Texas Army, and he also wrote about, in his memoirs, a similar sentiment of when his family left their home to join the flight to Louisiana. "It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we bid goodbye to the old home, never expecting to see the dear spot again. It was not a palatial home. The furniture was scant and rude. There was no organ or piano, but few pictures or books, and no carpets. But it was home in every sense to us," he continued. "It was humble but very dear, and the children cried all evening and that night till sleep finally came to their tired bodies. If mother shed a tear, I never knew it, though there was an unusual huskiness in her voice that day." So you feel the weight of leaving these homes in a panic that they had just created. Okay, and so the other thing I want to point out is what is really, if women are assigned to the home, and that is the sort of responsibility, creating a sense of sanctuary and place for their families, how are they in terms of relationships with men in the home? And so 19th century Southern notions of masculinity were rooted in celebrations of honor, land independence, and importantly, patriarchal control of women, children, and slave dependents. So a lot of the migrants to Texas during this time period, you're probably well aware, are coming from the South to expand on the expansion of cotton during this time period. Texas is a great place to grow cotton, and so we have a lot of people coming in from the South. And so they bring with them their notions of a Southern household, their patriarchal notions of a Southern. So historians have argued that patriarchal masculinity provided Southern men with a virtually unlimited right of an independent man to mastery over his household and property that lay within its boundaries. Okay, so he's the decision maker. And exerting and defining their manliness through their power over their households, including the defense of those households, Southern men became masters of small worlds. Okay, so that's sort of the way to think about women and power within those households. Now, there's a larger question about whether, again, this is an ideal and were women truly subservient to their households, right? To their husbands. Another thing I want to talk about with regards to the Runaway Scrape is that although it is commonly held that most of the participants of the scrape were comprised of thousands of refugees, largely women, children, and slaves, not all of the traveling parties were devoid of men. Okay, so in many instances, women negotiated power and decision-making with men deemed feeble, elderly, or generally unfit to fight. It should be noted that many of the men that avoided war were not in any of those categories, perfectly good health. But female-led groups encountered men along the way who often sought to assume authority over the situation. So women encountered them and men said, here, I'm going to stand up and do my role and allow me to make decisions for you. And so that's, and I'm going to talk about some encounters and see how that played out. So my study examines what I call gendered contestations, moments of confrontation between men and women as they were making their way to safety during this time period. And so, to develop the story, I use sources like Anne Rainey Coleman, and there are a lot of other reminiscences. A lot of these reminiscences are produced long after the fact. They're produced years after the fact. One of the more famous ones is by Deleuze Rose Harris. She was 11 years old at the time of the scrape. And she uses her father's journal to fill in the story, but ultimately it's going to be published in 3 segments in the quarterly of the State of Texas Historical Association, which becomes the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. So we see these long after the fact, decades after the fact, these stories about what happened to women during the Runaway Scrape and what happened to men, for that matter, during the Runaway Scrape and during the Texas Revolution more generally. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of instances of gendered contestation. Okay, so these are again involving men, so men are part of this story. And the first one, I don't have a picture of this because it's from the 1830s, so that's an impediment. But this is a picture of a wife and an old musket, and that is a pertinent picture to this conversation, even though this is obviously not the wife in question. So the story comes from a soldier named S.F. Sparks, who was a teenager in the Texas Army at the time. And he provides this account of a family he comes across that he sees during the Runaway Scrape. So Sparks described the atmosphere of the period as a complete panic. In this instance, a man, his wife, and 3 to 4 children join the retreat, driving 10 or 12 head of cattle east. His wife and youngest child rode a pony alongside. A group of people passed them and urged them to go as fast as they could because the Mexicans were close behind. Apparently the news was more than, and this is Sparks describing this, the heroic man could stand. And he told his wife that it would be better for one of them to escape than for all to be killed. Then he took her and the child off the horse, left them in the road, and came on and crossed the river. Unruffled, the wife and her children continued with the cattle, driving the cattle along the route, crossing the river, coming across the husband an hour later as he sat under a tree. And she told him, now you get behind this breastwork of cotton bales and fight. Despondent, he replied that it wasn't worth fighting and that they'd all be killed. And she replied, well, I will. If I can get a gun, I'll be darned if I don't get behind that breastwork and fight with those men. Sparks' messmate gave the woman an old musket, and she remained half the night behind the makeshift fortifications, presumably fighting alongside the men. One can guess when Sparks describing this man as a heroic man, he meant that in sarcasm. He doesn't obviously think he was. The episode clearly highlights the husband's failure to step up and fulfill his manly obligations, because part of what he was expected to do during this time period was to fight for his family, and he did not. So I want to go back actually to Anne Rainey Coleman, because I've got another example from her journal about another confrontation along these lines. I begin by sort of saying, she describes, as they're on the road, she would often, was often slow packing up. When the caravan of travelers were, breaking camp, she was slow doing it. Sometimes they were tired. She fell asleep. She didn't get up. And one time she woke up and her husband, her child, and the traveling party had left her behind. So she just woke up from a sleep and everybody was gone. So she got on her horse. Thankfully, she had the horse. And she got on her horse and she raced and met up with the party. So later that evening, her husband, Mr. Thomas, she's been married multiple times, if you're wondering about the names here, came to her to help her off her horse, but she refused his assistance. He was displeased with her response, explaining to his wife, "My child, I know you are angry with me, but I had to do something to alarm you, or you would have given me a great deal of trouble in the future." Not content with this rationale, Anne countered, I have been woman enough to pass through trials that a man strong in physical strength alone could not pass through, and that he need not doubt my mental faculties any more than my physical ones. Further, she continued, I myself was the last consideration in danger, that I thought only of him and my child. But now I began to think of him lacking in affection for me. Ultimately, Anne forgives her husband. But she noted that I did not forget this adventure, always telling my husband that he was a different man as a result of this. And you're sort of saying, well, why is he even, why isn't he fighting? Well, he had broken his arm in 2 places in a previous event, wasn't fighting, and sent his overseer to fight on his behalf. Okay, so he's a man who did not go to war, and he's leading his family. So this incident was neither the first nor the last time Anne Rainey Coleman would find cause to challenge her husband's decision-making. Another event, as the traveling party drew close to the Louisiana border, an altercation developed between her husband and 2 men regarding compensation for a slave girl, who was about 10 years of age, who was in the couple's possession, and the slave girl was serving as their young son's nurse, okay, so their child's nurse. The men claimed that John Thomas still owed them $50 for the little slave girl, and if he didn't pay, they would take the girl as security. When she saw that her husband was going to let them take the girl, Anne apparently threatened the men with a pistol, declaring, if my husband chooses to let you have that girl that is paid for up to $50, I will not. You must kill me first. Her husband took the pistol from her hand and said that he could tend to his own business. Before they left with the slave girl, one of the men said to Anne, who was visibly upset, Madame, you ought to be the man such times as these. So hence the quote that I have there, such times as these. You could defend yourself and your property if you had no husband. I should not have taken that girl from you, for I believe you would stay in the country and defend yourself and your property. So you see in these 2 examples, women are confronting their husbands. They are challenging their decision-making. So Anne's decision to include this in her memoirs is interesting, right? Why would she include this story in her memoirs? It's an obvious slight on her husband's manhood. In the eyes of this male contemporary, this man who was taking the slave, it was Anne who ought to be the man, for she would have defended the property. And this sort of extends in Anne's memoir to a larger question of her husband leaving in the first place, leaving their property and choosing not to return. And so she, if she says it was up to her, they would have fought for the property. She would have, fought for the child. Her husband failed to not only fight harder for the property, the slave girl, but he also failed to fight for their property in a larger sense. Okay, so he was again failing in his manly responsibilities. So the next thing I want to move on to is a discussion about deserters and the challenge of manly obligations. So this is kind of a shift to thinking about, I've been talking about women and their experience and expectations, but now I want to talk about what manly obligations were for men during this time period, and how deserters failed that challenge, according to people who were writing at the time. So setting the stage, I did mention that I wanted to talk a little bit about Sam Houston's retreat. So he's at the Colorado River, and at the time when he was stationed at the Colorado River, Mexican forces were across the river, and there was every expectation that he would challenge and confront the Mexican army at the Colorado River. But he had heard of, the fall at that point, the surrender of Fanning. And he also was concerned about the training of his men, that he was hoping for more men, for, expansion of his forces and also time to trade. So he decided to fall back at the Colorado River and not fight. Okay, so that adds to the anxiety of the period during this time period. This is happening, in the third week of March, when they're, decide to not fight and to retreat at the Colorado. And there's a lot of debate about Houston's decision to retreat. So we have, obviously, this is a moment that, adds fuel to the Runaway Scrape. And here's a painting of people fleeing. This works much better on a big, when I show this as a slide, and you can see this tiny little map a little better. But what I do like about the map is you can see some of the settlements. You can see, and you can see the routes essentially that Santa Ana is taking, Urea is taking, Houston takes, and that's what all these arrows and lines are sort of. But you can also, like I said, see the key settlements here, and obviously the route that people are going to be taking is towards the Louisiana border to the Sabine. So, I just wanted to give you a very small map to show. So what I want to talk about is, how deserters fit into this story of competing notions of manhood. And to get at that again, I want to talk about what were expectations of men during this time period. And so my research has been influenced by a historian named Amy Greenberg, who talks about two competing and two dominant expressions of manhood during the early to mid 19th century. The first is restrained manhood. And restrained men derive their manhood from being morally upright, reliable, brave, responsible. Okay, that's restrained manhood. Martial manhood, keyword in there, eschewed the restraint of their male counterparts. They don't believe in that restraint. They were, were into strength and aggression, even violence if necessary. That was part of who men were. They had to, they had this sort of aggressive aspect to their personality. So these are two competing notions that you see that she talks about. She knows that not all men fell squarely into one category or the other, and there was overlap clearly. And she positions these two models of manliness during this time period, which is a period of American expansion. And that's obviously appropriate to Texas in a larger sense. But you sort of see that this will also be relevant to what actually happens during the play of events. Again, setting the stage, we have Santa Ana moving his forces. The Mexican army is moving further and further into the settlements. Houston's army is falling back. And many of the men in the army were like, I got to go get my family. I got to be somewhere else right now. So there's going to be a large number of deserters, and sort of a larger question of, are these true deserters? They're going to, leave the army, as they say, temporarily, to go and help their families to safety, and then return to the army. And this becomes a sort of point of contention about how many deserters there are during this time period as all of this is playing out. So Creed Taylor, again, I mentioned him earlier, disclosed that Houston reported to the military commission that only 20 men deserted the ranks to join their families. But Taylor noted, I have undisputed knowledge that more than one squad left on the morning of the 14th. And during the day, there were more than 50 men who openly declared their intention of going to the relief of their threatened families. So, after the fall of the Alamo, even before Goliad, men are like, Santa Ana's advancing, I gotta go help my families. Now, you can see that this wouldn't go over well with Houston or the military. This is not helping the cause. And so I have this quote from David Burnett, who's the interim president of the Republic of Texas. And I think it kind of gets at this notion of manliness again. To provide for and protect our wives and children is a sacred duty, prompted by nature and sanctioned by every manly feeling. So he's recognizing that the men's sort of nature to protect their family. But he cautioned against acting on such impulses, and that the better strategy was to reinforce and sustain the army so that their wives and children would be secure from the pollution of the Mexican onslaught, as he put it. So he's saying, I get it. this is a problem, but you have to stay and fight. Delu Rose Harris, who I mentioned earlier, in her later reminiscences, she was sympathetic to the men who left the battlefield. She said, at the Trinity River, men from the army began to join their families. I know they have been blamed for this, but what else could they have done? The Texas army was retreating and the Mexicans were crossing the Colorado. So you see the moment of crisis. So there was, there's a debate. But there's also going to be a lot of criticism for men who choose not to fight, for deserters, but also men who were not even coming to the fight in the first place. So Mosley Baker, who I'm going to be talking about sort of in relation, you might be familiar with Mosley Baker, but he's a captain in the Texas forces. So in a letter he writes after the fall of the Alamo, March 8, 1836, this is what he's writing: will any man under these circumstances longer refuse to turn out because his interest requires his attention, when Texas is in danger of being overrun and the women and children in cold blood massacres? Going further still, he opined, let all who remain without satisfactory reasons be henceforth branded as a coward and a traitor and an enemy to Texas. So if you're not in the fight, you're an enemy to Texas. To drum up support for the war, Brigadier General T.J. Green, he was appealing to Americans to try and get support. And he said, tell them the ruthless murderer is upon our soul, that all rights of freemen are disregarded. Tell them our women have been assaulted, our virgins defiled, and our men treated as devils rather than Christians. So what they're doing there is they're, saying the threat to women and children, if you are true men, you need to come and fight because women and children are at risk. So this is trying to get in touch again with their manly obligation. The stark language of cold-blooded massacres of women and children and defiled virgins, no less, was meant to strike at the heart of 19th century notions of chivalry and manhood. There were penalties for men who didn't fight. Sorry, I had myself there. There were penalties of men who didn't fight. Burnett would later write, able-bodied men who didn't come to the fight shall forfeit his right of citizenship and all his lands in the Republic from henceforth treated as an alien and foreigner. Every name of those who defend the country shall be recorded, and those not on the list will be considered abandoning his country. So the debate over manliness sort of becomes a moment of contention, and it kind of consumes the debate between military officials during this time period. Even Sam Houston, his courage is going to be questioned, his decision to fall back. Some of his men who were writing, and including officials in the new government, are accusing him of cowardice, that he was afraid to fight during this time period. So the hero of San Jacinto himself during this period, his manliness is questioned. So it's kind of a tumultuous, as I said, dynamic between what women were supposed to do, what men were supposed to do, who was failing, who wasn't failing. And I want to sort of conclude my talk today by telling you a quick story about one of the most infamous moments during the Runaway Scrape. It involves, again, another gendered contestation, if you will. It involves a woman named Pamela Mann. Okay, so it's kind of an infamous moment, but I'm going to assume most of you hadn't heard of it, and so now you will. I want to get all the quotes, so I'm going to read this. In April 1836, Mann allowed Houston's men to impress the last of her remaining oxen, with the understanding that Houston's retreating forces would follow a similar road as herself towards Nacogdoches. Houston assured Mann that he planned to take the Nacogdoches road and not proceed towards Harrisburg, a condition insisted on by Mrs. Mann. However, according to soldier Robert Hancock Hunter, the general didn't stipulate to Mrs. Mann exactly how far he was going to go along the Nacogdoches road. So the army went about 6 miles up the road to where it forked, at which point Houston directed his forces to take the route to Harrisburg. Okay, upon hearing word that Houston's army had turned towards Harrisburg, Mann chased down the army, which had already advanced 10 or 12 miles along the road. Things got rather uncomfortable for Houston and his men once the widow caught up with them. S.F. Sparks, you remember him from earlier, the soldier. So he's going to reply, provide what happened next. He relayed the following account of what he witnessed. We had a yoke of oxen pressed that belonged to a Mrs. Mann. She was said to be a notorious woman. This woman rode up to General Houston and said, "General, I have come for my oxen and I'm going to have them." Houston said, "Madame, don't irritate me." Apparently, Mrs. Mann was not amused. She responded, "Irritate the devil. I'm going to have my oxen." Sparks noted that she drew a pistol and pulled upside the team and said, "Whoa," which prompted the team to stop. Houston ordered the driver to keep moving. Sparks claimed the driver fell in the water and said, "Oh Lord, I'm shot." Next, Mrs. Mann unhitched the oxen and drove off. Okay, Sparks concluded the description by stating, "We call this Houston's defeat." Now, Robert Hancock Hunter's account of the confrontation indicated that Mrs. Mann employed some rather salty language to accentuate her message to Houston. He remembered her saying, "General, you told me a damn lie. You said you was going on the Nacogdoches Road. Sir, I want my oxen." Houston explained to Mrs. Mann that he could not spare the oxen because they needed them to pull a cannon. Mrs. Mann replied, "I don't give a damn for your cannon. I want my oxen." Equipped with 2 holster pistols and a very large knife, Mrs. Mann jumped down from her horse, turned around the oxen, and proceeded to cut the rawhide tug with her knife, releasing the oxen to her control. All the while, nobody said a word. As one chronicler would later note, this woman defied the whole army. Whatever account is more accurate, it is clearly a heated exchange. Revolution historian Paul Lack succinctly summed up the episode by noting that Mrs. Mann retrieved her oxen in a scene full of indelicate language, threats, and brandishing of pistols. Houston ordered his wagon master to retrieve the oxen from Mann. However, when he returned empty-handed with a badly torn shirt, he justified his failure to recover the oxen by stating, "She was a man after all." Then and now, Pamela Mann is admired for her pluck, her willingness to challenge the leader of the Texas forces to protect her property after General Houston reneged on their initial agreement to take the Nacogdoches Road. In no rendition of the Mann-Houston confrontation is Mann presented as a shrinking violet, or perhaps more aptly, a Texas bluebonnet. It is precisely her show of strength and unladylike exploits that registered amusement with those who witnessed the events, as well as later commentators. Similar to other women who challenged men during their flight to Louisiana and at times wielded pistols, Mrs. Mann applied an appropriate and admired display of nerve towards Houston and his men on that April day in the spring of 1836. To a certain degree, the exigencies of war and the panicked exodus of the civilian population jumbled social norms and gendered expectations. As Mann biographer William Ransom Hogan wrote, "In an age in which self-effacement behind a family front was held to be a high female virtue, the self-reliance of her kind adds bold and welcome strokes to a cross-section picture of the womanhood of her time." So she sort of, expands our notion about what was expected in this time of jumbled chaos, if you will. You've got, in this instance, another gender contestation to, of all people, Sam Houston. So I think that is, to me, a good way to end, because you kind of get the feel for these different notions of, expectations regarding what a woman was supposed to do, what a man was supposed to do, and when they failed. So my question was, did the latter stages of the Texas Revolution, specifically the Runaway Scrape, create circumstances that challenged 19th century notions of gender? And my answer would be yes. And I will end there.
Well, thank you very much for that. The questions have been rolling in, and we appreciate the mention of Mosley Baker. We talk about him a lot in our museum and his role as captain in the militia here. So I guess to start off, where did the term runaway scrape come from? Now, was that a contemporary term? Was this a way to describe it in later years, or were people actually using those words at the time?
That is a good question. They were used at the time, and it's actually a term of the time period. The first incidents that I see of it being used in the records that I've looked at is in a letter a soldier writes during this time period in mid-March.
Oh, okay.
So he uses the term runaway scrape, and there are others. Sometimes it's been referred to as the Sabine shoot, or there are, but runaway scrape is the most commonly used term. So it's from the time period, and then it kind of continues long after.
Okay. Oh, that makes sense. Do you recommend, are there any books or other resources that document the lives of women or families who survive a lost spouse or father killed in the revolution?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, one of the greatest sources is the women's writings themselves. And if you are a member of the Texas State Historical Association, maybe you have access to the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. The Quarterly of the State of Texas did publish a lot of these at the turn of the century. Deleuze Rose Harris's memoirs are published 1900, 1901. So you can actually go to the source and read them yourselves. But in terms of scholarly presentations of the work, I think one of there's a couple of articles on the Runaway Scrape. There has not been a full-length monograph. I'd like to say until now, hopefully. So my work is hopefully addressing that fact, that there isn't one yet. But a few years ago, I think 2012, an edited collection, Women in the Texas Revolution, with the editor Mary Shear was produced. Oh, there we go. How apt.
Yes.
There is a chapter on the Runaway Scrape in there by Light Cummings. So there's material out there article wise, but like I said, I really recommend going to the sources because they're so powerful to read the full experience of women during this time period. And it's been a multi-year event for me to find and track down as many sources as I could. So
Yes, yeah, we go back to the original sources a lot when we're doing research here. Would you happen to know what was the source on your Sparks story? You know how you mentioned S. Sparks?
Yeah, I do happen to know that. Let me just pull that up. It is in the Quarterly again. I might as well do their advertising here for them. So it's called The Recollections of S.F. Sparks, the Quarterly of the State of Texas Historical Association, July 1908.
Okay.
So he's got, and his story, I mean, obviously a lot of the soldier stories, I think they're interesting because I do think they say stuff about manly obligations, but they're obviously really focused on the fighting. They're not really mostly written. A couple years ago, you mentioned an article I wrote for Central Texas Studies. I transcribed a letter by Guy Bryan that talks about his experiences during the Runaway Scrape. It was just a handwritten letter, and I felt like others, like it's loosely mentioned in one turn of the century history of the Texas Revolution, but it really hadn't been delved into in a detailed way. And I really felt like it needed to be available for people, for researchers to sort of look at, because he talks about how he felt like as a 16-year-old at the time he was sort of failing. Because he couldn't, they get exploited by robbers or pressmen, and he feels very vulnerable. And it kind of gets you into those notions of manhood again.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to look that one up. So what about the women who didn't have any male companions and had to take charge?
Well, there are women that did actually. A lot of the traveling parties are headed by women, and there are some there's some of their stories are told. Not every one of the stories that I talk about. George Sutherland's mother, so there are, again, off the top of my head, think of all of them. There's probably, in terms of extant records, at least 10 or to at least 15 accounts of women's runaway scrape experience. So there's, and a lot of those are not headed by men, but a lot of times they do, in the course of telling their story, mention encounters they had with men. So that's an interesting. Now, one story that isn't well documented, there's a couple of references to it, and Mary Sherwood Helm's writing, Deleuze Rose Harris talks about it a bit, was the role of slave men and slaves generally in terms of the retreat. Because there are instances of families who left their slaves behind to protect their property, which is really something,
yes.
Because they're so expensive, obviously. But there are also families that are traveling with slaves. And in a couple of the instances, they talk about, the slave men serving as guards while they slept at night and protecting the families in that regards. And of course, a lot of heavy lifting is done by slaves. So if families were wealthy enough to have slaves and could use slave labor They obviously had an advantage over people who didn't. And, I didn't go into it too much, and maybe, you guys have more of this, tell this story more at the museum, but the conditions are terrible. During the Runaway Scrape, it's raining incessantly. Rivers are overflowing. As these families are moving to the rivers, they can't cross, all the sort of ferry crossings are completely overrun. There's disease that spreads through the camps. And so, there are some of the travelers that lose, the most vulnerable babies that are lost during this time period. So it's just, as much as you can imagine the sadness of losing your home and the fear of running for your lives, the conditions were horrific.
Yes, definitely. And we're coming up actually to the anniversary of the burning of the town here in San
Oh,
Felipe.
okay. I did mention, I've got a little, I don't know if you guys talk about Mosley Austin Bryan's account. Do you guys talk about that? This is from his writing. Mosley Austin Bryan is Stephen Austin's nephew. And so he's talking about his experience. He's under Mosley Baker. So Mosley Baker is ordered to burn down the town. And as you said before, Sam Houston denies that this was an official order, but this is what Moses Austin Bryan, he challenges Houston's assertion that he did not order the burning of San Felipe. Bryan asserted that he was initially ordered by Captain Mosley Baker to burn the town, but he asked to be excused from the assignment because I did not wish to destroy the first town laid by my uncle in the wilderness of Texas. And he then ordered Edward Pettus to burn the town at Houston's command. According to Bryan, many of the men disapproved of the burning of the town, the enemy having not yet arrived. When the news came that Houston denied giving the command, Baker wrote to Houston seeking confirmation. What do we got here? Houston responded to Baker's letter that, which Bryan witnessed. He said he was perfectly satisfied with everything that Captain Baker had done while in command at that post. So you can clearly, the debate continues amongst the various soldiers. And I do talk about, the decision to burn, if you are, the family members who've burned, there's certainly instances of people who burn their homes, so that the enemy can't use, fence posts or any of their
food, shelter,
anything, right? They didn't want to help the enemy in any way, shape, or form. You can imagine, so I sort of talk about it as part of the trauma of imagining what it would be like to build a home, and feel proud of your home and feel like it is a sanctuary, and then have that home, you burn it to the ground. And so in some cases, San Felipe, it devastates the importance of the town historically, in terms of its role in early Texas. So it has obviously devastating impacts.
Right. San Felipe didn't actually recover very well.
It doesn't, right.
So I've got a good question for you. So some of the women of the scrape hardly had easy lives of cloistered domesticity before. So we have Rosa Kleberg, who survives a shipwreck, while she's coming from Germany. Anne Rainey Coleman had participated at the Battle of Velasco. Emily Perry's run a boarding house in Missouri and worked as a laundress. So did that count for something along with the general rigors of the frontier?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why you have to problematize this cult of domesticity, because it just doesn't work. I mean, when you're thinking about these separate spheres, a lot of those examples in women's prescriptive literature are from urban settings, and middle class and upper class settings, right? I mean, women worked, when you're looking at it from a class perspective, women worked. Women worked in the fields if you were slaves. Women worked, immigrants worked. So there's obviously a lot of instances of women working. And when it comes to rural life, setting up a farm, it was a whole family endeavor. So absolutely, women participated. And actually, I talk about Rosa Kleberg quite a bit because she's an important source for my work. And that's another example of a traveling party. She was led, that had the Von Roters had males in their traveling party again, and I talk about that. But he was older, her father, so it was there was the age of conscription was 56.
Yes,
So,
he
you know,
just
and
misses.
DeLuRose Harris, by the way, her father was 56.
Mhm.
Maybe, yeah, I think right on the cusp, but he missed it. So there were, you know, what we consider to be older or elderly, or, you know, obviously is time specific. And in times of war, anybody that could participate could, but they had the excuse. They were not forced to. But there was a lot of men. Paul Lack talks about men who were in the government, men of means, who avoided war, who sent people in their stead, who, you know, said, well, we have a government to run. And there's some critique actually that comes from the sources, including Houston, who says, you know, it's you, talking about representatives of the government running for your lives that are creating more panic, because the men in the government are also escaping. You create panic, you add to this, because of course there's a blame game going on of who's more at fault for how bad things are going in March and April in terms of the war, well, before until it doesn't go bad.
Definitely, and we have an exhibit on Rosa Kleberg as well, and you know everyone always fixates on that she brought a piano with her, and that's not
Yeah.
the first thing, and it survives the shipwreck, which is even more amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about also what it was like and how people, you know, the things that they thought important. You know, Anne Rainey Coleman, she talks about this china set that she has, where she had, her husband told her to get rid of anything we don't need. And she had this prized china set, and she hid it in the cart. He snuck it into the cart, and he found it, and he put it by the side of the road. And she was very upset about, again, you know, sort of another moment of what you had of loss. I know it's, you know, maybe it doesn't seem as important, certainly not as important as some of the bigger issues, but it was another ways in which people felt sad and loss.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. We've got a good question of how wide was the swath of the Runaway Scrape? You know, you hear a lot about the little choke points, you know, with the river crossings, but is it all of Texas that you're seeing kind of picking up and moving, you know?
Well, again, timing is everything, because there are people who live in further South Texas and San, you know, like, and that actually, the scrape, if you know, are talking about the full scrape, really begins in January. So it is, you know, it is the route of essentially the Mexican army. So they're going to, you know, cross the Rio Grande and come north and head towards San Antonio. So it is affecting people, you know, wherever there are settlements along that route. You know, the people in Nacogdoches are interesting because they're, of course, all the way over in East Texas. And the Mexican army never gets close to Nacogdoches, but there's a lot going on in Nacogdoches, and they're very worried. Yeah, well, people are coming through there, but they're actually really worried about attack from Native American tribes. So they have this, they feel that they're particularly vulnerable, and they have men assigned to protect them. And they're actually able to get, this is sort of an aside, but they are able to get the US Army to come in with 500 men during this time period to protect the women and children from, there's a, you know, fear of the Mexican army and Native Americans joining forces, and, you know, they're going to kill all the women and children. So temporarily, Gaines is the person that's in charge of the Fort Jessup, and he comes in temporarily and has to make a case for it. So it's kind of an interesting aside. You think Nacogdoches is far enough away that they didn't have to worry, but they were worried.
They were worried.
Everybody was worried during this time period.
So I think we've got time for one more question, and it kind of fits into this. Like, with limited communications, how aware of what was going on in the revolutions was the average family? You know, are you?
Well, not very aware, and actually, so, you know, sometimes they had emissaries from the army were sent to settlements to tell them move. So you had that going on. You know, one of the problems of bad communication is rumor. So there was a lot of indication of, you know, the Mexicans are like, you know, 20 miles, and people panicked, and a lot of times that wasn't even true. So they you know, that there's so much fear and so much chaos going on during this time period. And the communication is quite terrible, as you can well imagine, that you have to contend with rumor. You know, there's one instance where, you know, somebody's blowing up some barrels of something and people think it's the Mexican army, you know, and they run and they're, you know, so lots of things like that happen under those circumstances. But no, communication was quite terrible.
Well, we kind of had that too. I think San Felipe arguably could have been, got burnt a little bit sooner than possibly it needed to.
Right. Yeah.
So my site manager, Brian McCauley, has been writing down all the questions on a whiteboard. So his hand's about to catch on fire here. But unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time. We are keeping a record of all the questions, and we'll be talking with Dr. English to try and get some proper answers for that. But to finish off, as always, we have worked on a way for our audience to get some discounts on items relating to our discussion topic. So for this month, please consider purchasing our Party on the Brazos, which includes the Emily Austin of Texas book, an Independence coffee or tea mug, and a package of Party on the Brazos loose leaf tea. So this set is available in our museum store, or if you call, we can ship you these items. And the cost is $40 for the set, plus shipping and handling. Next month, we've already got our speaker lined up, and we've got Kate Johnson, who is the lead educator at the San Jacinto Battleground State Historic Site. She will be presenting on flags of the Texas Revolution. So the Lone Star flag officially became the national flag of the Republic of Texas on January 25th, 1839, but it wasn't the first flag to represent Texas. So join us on Thursday, April the 22nd to look at some of the many flags that flew during the Texas Revolution. If you're wondering, the flags of the Texas Revolution are already flying near the monument, which will reopen on April the 1st. Now, as always, we would like to thank all the staff, volunteers, and supporters who make these programs possible. And finally, if you would like to get in touch with any of us here, please do so. If you have any ideas for other topics you'd like to see at History at Night, we'd love to hear about them as well. So thank you very much, Dr. English. We've had great response and a great turnout for your talk tonight. So for everyone, thank you very much, and we hope you have a good rest of your evening. So good night.
Bye.
Bye.